It began with smoke thick as velvet, curling through the hallways of a house she'd called home. A cold winter's night, her 7th birthday already fading behind her. Flames devoured wallpaper and splintered wood, the air cracking with heat. Screams died in smoke, and little Emily Carter, barefoot and shivering, stood frozen on the front lawn as the world she knew turned to cinders behind her. Her parents were dead. The official report called it an accident, faulty wiring, but even at 7, Emily knew the house had been sturdy. Her father, a meticulous contractor, kept everything in working order. Nothing felt right about the way the fire roared to life, nor how quickly the insurance company declared her family's possessions irrecoverable. The neighborhood whispered, the way small towns did, but with fear instead of sympathy. In the months that followed, Emily was sent to live with her godfather, Vincent Green, a man whose hands were always lined with gold rings and who smelled of old money. Vincent, her father's old friend, was a man who laughed too loudly at the dinner table, who signed checks with a flourish, and who made sure Emily's schooling continued. Though she noticed her parents' modest savings were gone, their business folded into one of Vincent's holding companies. Years passed. Emily learned how to smile when she was supposed to. She attended private schools, wore designer shoes, and memorized the subtle shifts in Vincent's face when he lied. She pieced together whispered conversations between his associates and studied the late-night phone calls that ended with Vincent slamming his glass down, the liquor splashing like blood. She grew up in wealth she hated, in a world that spun around secrets and money. By her 18th birthday, Emily was no longer a girl. She had learned to move quietly, to pick locks on Vincent's study, to slip into his personal files. The truth came to her in jagged pieces: bank records, off-the-books transactions, coded emails. The night her home had burned, Vincent's debt to a criminal enterprise had come due. Her father had refused to sell the family construction business to cover Vincent's losses. Instead, Vincent had made the debt disappear the only way he knew: through fire and silence. The fire wasn't an accident. It was an execution. But it was the photograph that broke her. Hidden beneath layers of accounting records was a single image: her parents' bodies, broken and bound, their throats cut before the fire had even touched them. The flames were staged to cover the murder. The godfather she called Uncle Vince had killed them. From that moment, Emily was no longer Emily. She dropped out of college and disappeared. In her place, a series of false identities blossomed. Anna Wyatt, a digital forensics consultant. Megan Lewis, an event coordinator. Jordan Hill, a quiet, forgettable assistant at one of Vincent's lesser-known subsidiaries. For years she moved through the shadows of his empire, gathering everything she needed. Vincent Green's world was vast, his influence sprawling through politics, finance, and real estate. But he was also arrogant, certain his power made him untouchable. Emily exploited that arrogance, planting forged evidence in his records, tipping off regulatory agencies, creating digital footprints that pointed to fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. Slowly, she turned his fortress into a labyrinth of lies, each door leading to another scandal, another inquiry. She knew she couldn't take him down with a single blow. It had to be systematic, surgical. He had built an empire on secrets and deception, so she made the truth his poison. Late one autumn, Vincent received a letter postmarked from an anonymous sender. It contained a single sentence: "Ashes to ashes, Vince." Beneath it was a photograph, his own hand, marked with a tattoo he had gotten in his youth, gripping the gas can used to ignite the Carter house. Vincent panicked. He called in favors, tried to erase evidence, but the deeper he dug, the more dirt surfaced. Anonymous leaks appeared in newspapers. Investigations were launched into his businesses. Subpoenas landed like bombs on his desk. Board members resigned. His political connections evaporated. Still, he clung to the belief that he could fix it, that he was smarter. Emily watched from the sidelines, each step of his unraveling more satisfying than the last. But she wasn't done. Not yet. She wanted him to feel it. The fear, the isolation, the knowledge that everything he had built was crumbling because of a truth he thought he had buried under ash. In the weeks before the end, Vincent's mansion stood hollow. His staff, once obedient, whispered in the hallways. His wife left him, taking the children and what money she could. His lawyers refused to return his calls. He drank alone at night, watching news reports that named him a criminal, a liar, a fraud. And then came the fire. It started in the study, spreading with a precision Emily had learned from the files she had stolen long ago. Smoke billowed from the windows, flames licking the walls of Vincent's estate, but this time he was trapped inside. The doors were locked, the security system overridden. The fire was slow, creeping, giving him time to realize this was no accident. This was justice. From the safety of a nearby hill, Emily watched as the mansion collapsed in on itself. The smoke rose thick and black into the sky. She felt no fear, no regret, only a quiet, satisfied emptiness. Ashes to ashes. This was just the beginning. Vincent Green's mansion was nothing more than smoldering debris by morning. Fire crews arrived too late to save the estate. The media descended like vultures, broadcasting images of charred ruins and speculating on the fire's origin. Authorities labeled it suspicious, but there was no evidence left to trace. No one suspected that the inferno had been anything more than the result of Vincent's financial collapse. An act of desperation, perhaps, or an accident in the dead of night? But Emily, standing under the pale dawn sky with smoke clinging to her coat, knew differently. She knew the fire had been her signature, the final page of a story she had written over years. Yet as the mansion crumbled behind her, she felt no finality. The truth was, Vincent hadn't died in that fire. He'd fled hours before, driven by paranoia, guided by a tip Emily had deliberately planted, a fabricated threat of arrest, a call from an informant warning him that law enforcement was on its way. She'd given him just enough fear to abandon his estate, leaving behind the last of his illusions of control. He was on the run now, stripped of wealth and connections, his accounts frozen, his assets seized under the weight of investigations that seemed to sprout overnight. Emily had made sure of it, slipping anonymous packages to journalists and investigators. Each package contained damning evidence. Emails, false bank statements, illicit contracts, all cleverly crafted to appear genuine. Enough truth salted in to make it impossible to ignore. Vincent fled into the shadows, but Emily knew exactly where he was headed. He had one last refuge, a decaying property he'd acquired under a shell corporation years earlier. An old hunting lodge in northern Vermont, nestled deep in a forest where no one would look for him. She followed him there, unseen, watching from a distance as he holed up like a cornered animal. During the lodge, Vincent drank himself into stupors, his once pristine suits now wrinkled and stained. He cursed the betrayal he couldn't trace, the fortune he couldn't reclaim. His calls for help went unanswered. His name was poisoned now, his power eroded into ash. But Emily wasn't finished. In the weeks that followed, she infiltrated his hiding place under a new name, Paige Taylor, a freelance IT consultant specializing in data recovery. She presented herself as a lifeline, a professional who could clean up his digital footprint, wipe away any evidence that might surface from his past dealings. Vincent, desperate and half-mad, let her in. Inside the lodge, Emily worked silently, watching him unravel further. His paranoia bled into every conversation. He accused her of spying, of stealing, but then begged her to stay, offering promises of payment, of safety, of power. She pretended to accept, all the while feeding his delusions. One night, as the wind howled through the broken windows of the lodge, Vincent sat before a dying fire, staring into the embers. He mumbled about debts, about the people he owed, about a life that had crumbled faster than he could understand. Emily sat across from him, quiet, her eyes reflecting the flames. "You think it's over, don't you?" she said softly, her voice almost lost in the crackle of wood. Vincent's head snapped up, his eyes bloodshot. What do you mean? You think running will save you, she continued, but this isn't about money or influence anymore. This is about truth, about the lies you thought you could bury. Vincent stared at her, confusion clouding his features. Then his expression twisted, realization dawning like a slow, creeping horror. "Emily," he whispered. Her smile was thin, sharp as a knife. "Ashes to ashes, Vince." Before he could move, before he could scream, she left him there, locked inside the lodge, its doors chained shut from the outside. She set the fire carefully, using accelerants he had stored carelessly in the basement. The flames took hold, climbing greedily through the walls, consuming everything as they went. She stood in the snow outside, the air bitter and sharp, watching as the fire turned the lodge into a towering inferno. Vincent's screams were muffled by the crackle of flames and the howling wind. The light of the fire cast flickering shadows across the trees, illuminating her face, her eyes reflecting not triumph, but a cold, unrelenting resolve. This was justice, the culmination of years of meticulous planning, of living in the shadows, of becoming the ghost that haunted his every step. When the fire finally died, when the last embers cooled into ash, Emily turned away. She had buried her parents once, their bodies hidden beneath the lie of a fire staged to erase them. Now she had burned the architect of that lie, leaving him in the same silence he had once condemned them to. But Emily knew this wasn't the end. Vincent's empire had tentacles, loyalists who would seek to restore his name, rebuild his power. And there were debts left unpaid, secrets still lingering in the corners of his crumbling legacy. She wasn't done yet. This was only the second act. Emily's reflection in the frosted window was no longer the face of a haunted girl. It was the face of a woman forged in ash and ice. After the fire consumed Vincent Green's last hiding place, after his charred remains were found by state authorities, the world whispered about his death. But the story soon twisted. Publicly, it was a tragic accident, a broken man tormented by scandal meeting a lonely end. The tabloids speculated but didn't question. But Emily knew it wasn't over. The stains Vincent left behind were too deep to be washed away by a single funeral, no matter how dramatic. Within days of his death, the old guard of his empire began shifting like a nest of snakes disturbed. Lawyers emerged from the shadows with fresh documents claiming assets he'd hidden offshore. Former associates fought over shell companies and buried accounts. The media called it a power vacuum, but Emily knew it was a last, desperate attempt to salvage something from the ruin. She didn't let them. With identities she had prepared years in advance, she posed as creditors, whistleblowers, even investors. She slipped digital evidence into the right hands, a ledger showing illicit payments to city officials, offshore transfers to accounts named for deceased partners, falsified invoices tied to non-existent companies. The pressure built. One by one, Vincent's loyalists were exposed, their reputations shredded under the weight of fraud, bribery, and tax evasion. Civil suits piled up like corpses. One former partner fled the country, only to find his passport flagged and his accounts frozen. Another was arrested at his own retirement gala, the warrants delivered by federal agents in front of flashing cameras. But Emily wasn't content with financial ruin. She wanted them to feel the same helplessness her parents must have felt, trapped in that burning house. She wanted them to know that the walls were closing in, and no amount of money or influence could save them. Her next move was psychological. She targeted Vincent's remaining loyalists one by one, sending them anonymous packages containing exact transcripts of conversations they believed were private. She revealed their own betrayals, their hidden crimes, the skeletons they thought buried. She seeded rumors through anonymous tips to journalists, leaked memos to watchdog groups, and orchestrated damning social media posts that trended for days. One by one, they began to turn on each other. Boardroom meetings ended with shouting matches, lawsuits turned vicious, former friends became bitter enemies. Emily watched from a distance, her hands steady, her mind clear. But there was one name she hadn't crossed off her list yet. Linda Cross? Linda was Vincent's fixer, a woman whose hands were clean only because she paid others to do the dirty work. She'd been the one to smooth over the arson investigation, to bribe local officials, to make the police report vanish into the archive. Without Linda, Vincent's cover-up wouldn't have held. Emily knew where she was. Linda had retreated to an exclusive resort on a private island in the Caribbean, convinced she was untouchable. But even islands couldn't hide the truth. Using credentials crafted under the identity of a high-profile security consultant, Emily secured a contract with the resort, posing as an expert brought in to tighten digital defenses. She arrived under a different name, Kate Simmons, and quickly identified Linda's suite in the most secluded wing of the resort. Late one night, Emily entered Linda's suite using a key card cloned from hotel records. The woman was asleep, the ocean whispering outside. Emily stood over her, the weight of years pressing down on her shoulders. She didn't wake Linda with a gunshot or a scream. Instead, she slipped a small device under Linda's mattress, a signal jammer that would block all outgoing calls. Then she left a tablet on the nightstand, set to play a video on a loop. The video was simple. It showed a reconstruction of the fire at the Carter house, overlaid with data Emily had extracted from Vincent's old files. Heat signatures, accelerant patterns, entry points. The truth laid bare, rendered in chilling detail. When Linda awoke, she found the tablet playing, the room silent except for the crackling of virtual flames. Panic overtook her, but no call went through, no message sent. She was trapped in her own nightmare. Emily watched from the security room, silent and still, as Linda tore the room apart in desperation. Hours later, Linda was escorted off the island by local authorities, trembling, incoherent, muttering about fires and shadows. Emily's anonymous tips to regulatory bodies ensured Linda's accounts were frozen, her influence stripped, her name forever tied to the Carter fire. With Linda gone, the last pillar of Vincent's empire crumbled. Emily returned to the mainland under yet another name, her steps silent, her presence unseen. But she knew there was one more task, not just vengeance, but the final, irreversible erasure of the lie that had stolen her parents. The truth had to be public, undeniable. She'd prepared her last move, a leak to the press containing everything: the forensic analysis of the fire, the financial records tracing payments from Vincent to local officials, the emails detailing the cover-up, photos of her parents' bodies, the real story of what happened that night. She crafted the leak meticulously, ensuring it couldn't be traced back to her. Then, with a steady hand, she hit send. The truth spread like wildfire, igniting public outrage. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves from Vincent's name, former partners disavowed any connection, the local police department reopened the arson case, forced to admit their failure. For the first time in decades, Emily's parents' names were cleared. But she wasn't there to bask in the headlines. She had vanished into the crowd, a ghost, slipping through the cracks of a world that now echoed with justice. The final chapter wasn't yet written, but the ashes were hers. The storm that Emily unleashed didn't settle quickly. It spread through cities and boardrooms like a sickness, through news outlets and social media like a contagion of truth. Names that once drew respect were now spoken with disdain. Vincent Green's legacy became a cautionary tale whispered in back rooms, a story of power built on lies and reduced to rubble. But Emily wasn't content with whispered warnings. She stood at the edge of the cemetery where her parents lay. The markers were simple, understated, the grass freshly trimmed. For years, they had been just names carved in stone, victims of a fire no one cared to investigate. Now, thanks to the evidence she'd released, they were recognized for what they were: victims of murder orchestrated by a man who had believed himself invincible. She knelt, brushing her fingers over the cold granite. The wind was sharp against her skin, but she welcomed it, the sting a reminder that she was alive. "I did it, Mom." "Dad," she whispered, "I burned down everything he built. I made sure no one would forget you again." A bird called sharply from a nearby tree. Emily stood, smoothing her coat, and turned toward the waiting car. But there was still one last name left on her list. Not a business partner, not an associate of Vincent's, someone who had never been in the spotlight, who had never faced consequences. Sheriff Dale Curtis, the man who had declared the fire accidental, who had closed the investigation in under a week, ignoring evidence, discarding reports, who had been seen, years later, at Vincent's charity galas, his pockets lined with quiet bribes. Emily found him living comfortably in a lakeside home, retired and untouched by scandal. His name was clean, his reputation intact. His hands, she knew, were just as bloody as Vincent's. It was time for the final fire. She rented a cabin across the lake, a quiet, unobtrusive place where she could watch his routine. Dale's days were predictable. Morning coffee on the porch, fishing in the afternoon, evenings spent reading by the fireplace. His life was a carefully constructed lie of peace. Emily sent him a package. Inside was a stack of photocopied police reports from the original fire. The altered pages, the signatures, forged by his own hand. There was also a letter, typed and unsigned. You let them die. You buried the truth. You're next. The next day she watched from the shore as Dale stumbled through his routine, his hands trembling, his gaze darting to every shadow, his fishing line tangled, his coffee spilled. That evening his front door was bolted shut by sundown, the blinds drawn, his silhouette hunched and small against the window. Emily waited. A week later he broke. He turned himself in, trembling and disjointed, confessing not only to his part in covering up the Carter murders, but also to a string of other bribes and hush deals spanning decades. His confession wasn't spurred by conscience, it was born from fear, the fear that whoever had sent that package was coming for him next. With Dale's confession, the last cracks in Vincent's empire split wide. Dozens of cases were reopened. Lawsuits reached settlements. Families of victims long silenced found their voices. And Emily Carter finally laid down her mask. She left the country under her real name, traveling to quiet towns where no one knew her story, where she could sit in a cafe without feeling the weight of a false identity. She found work as a systems analyst in a small tech firm. Her talents now turned to honest labor. No more lies. No more masks. But at night, when the world was silent, she still heard the crackle of flames. She still saw the reflection of fire in the window of her childhood home. One winter evening she returned to the property where the Carter house once stood. The land had been sold and resold, abandoned, overgrown with weeds. She stood at the edge of the clearing, listening to the wind through the trees. From her pocket, she pulled a small silver urn, the remains of the ashes collected from the original fire, the last tie to her past. She opened the urn and scattered the ashes into the wind, watching as they swirled and disappeared into the darkening sky. The weight on her chest lifted, not all at once, but enough to let her breathe. As she stood there, alone in the growing dusk, Emily whispered, "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. No more lies, no more fire." She turned and walked away, leaving behind the ground that had stolen her family, her childhood, and her innocence. The past was gone. She had burned it all down, and from those ashes she had found herself. And this time, the fire was truly out.